Good morning, people. Right, okay. Today we'll look at kind of feminism around the history, boys. Now, this may initially strike you as only relevant to the gender and sexuality question. Um, and yes, probably the way we talk about it will focus around that more than the other two questions. But having said that, there are still ways to work in what we talk about today to the other two questions. So, if you're talking about kind of one of the dangers of education, well, the way that women are kind of brought out, excluded, pushed to the sidelines can be argued as a danger within education and within that kind of academic field more widely. Um, when we come on to kind of points around Fiona and the headmaster, it can potentially link into the kind of the abuse question and things as well. So yes, it will possibly slant more towards the gender and sexuality, but don't think of it just as linked into those, okay? So, in terms of what we're kind of focusing on, we're going to think, just contextualize the discussion, gender in narratives as a whole. This is something you can talk about in all of your different texts. We'll then link in kind of Fiona, and we'll talk about her in kind of several different ways in relation to how she's been done in different interpretations. Key areas of kind of characterization around her, so kind of profiling her, looking at where she's kind of characterized throughout the text, and then kind of debate her importance as a character in relation to as a plot device, looking at kind of the closing sections where she gets her kind of final mention. And then obviously the other main female character is Mrs. Lintott. We need to look at how she's used kind of directly to challenge the male figures, and sort of debate essentially around it. Is she successful as a kind of feminist icon within the play? I don't know if that's quite the right word, but as a kind of feminist voice within the play, possibly be a slightly better word. Right, okay, so to start with, I would just like to spend kind of 5-10 minutes as a start to think about your other texts as well, okay? Think about how feminism comes into them, and this is important because if you are doing that second Hamlet question, you can potentially talk about feminist interpretations. Within the Gatsby comparison question, you can get kind of marks for this in terms of different interpretations, potentially linking into the context. So just have a think quickly, how has kind of ideas of feminism cropped up in our kind of other texts? Go. Okay, so I mean, if you're thinking about Gatsby, you've maybe come up with ideas of um, Daisy and her kind of marginalised position in relation to Tom, her daughter coming into it. You might talk about Jordan as the kind of the new woman. You might, as you go into kind of Hamlet, be focusing around Ophelia, her kind of position within the play, her marginalisation, thinking to her kind of death, how she kind of regains a kind of power in her madness and up to the point of her death. And a good extension activity just to kind of, be going back over these texts, getting them back into mind, would be to actually go back to them directly, and kind of go back over evidence overall within them, spend some time kind of studying around them in relation to feminism as your kind of focal point. And that will stand you in good stead for the exam potentially. But we go to the history, boys, okay? Now, the first thing to kind of consider within this is the adaptations. Now, Fiona, in theory, is never actually seen on stage, and she never has a kind of a speaking role at all. Now, within the film version which you've watched, the Heitner version, she does actually have, she's given a few very brief kind of spoken elements. You might look at her within the kind of film adaptation slightly further in the she's kind of those interactions with Dakin at various points and how they're done can be quite interesting. That there's a kind of degree of power within that relationship, and we do get kind of a slight insight into it that we don't necessarily get in the play. In the Wolverhampton one that we went to go and see, she was given no speaking role. She was only ever kind of presented on that background screen in video format between the kind of, or as part of the scene transitions even. So you want to kind of consider Fiona here. She's a good way to get in. Links to different adaptations and interpretations. She can be very useful in terms of doing that and hitting your kind of AO5. Okay, so we don't want to have a look at her properly. Okay, hang on. Anyway, so sorry. What you want to be kind of thinking here, and you're going to use the kind of whole play. I'll give you some kind of page references you might use in a minute. How does Bennett kind of characterize the relationship between Fiona and Dakin in terms of the kind of dynamic between them, the power structures? How does Bennett actually kind of suggest that Dakin sees Fiona? So if you're looking kind of through Dakin's eyes, what's the kind of implication about the way that he views her, the way that he kind of sees her? Sorry, coming back to that same point, who is it who's kind of depicted as having the power within the relationship? Is it entirely one-sided to Dakin, or is there kind of some element of kind of power going the other way? I would be using here, page 22 is the kind of first reference to the relationship. Page 28 to 29 is his sort of first reference, this kind of abortive thrust. And page 80 to 81 is where he kind of characterizes it around the kind of Weimar Republic. Right, so what I would like you to do here, please, people, I want you to kind of, I'd take a sheet in your notebook, annotate in the book as well, but try and draw together all the various points around kind of Fiona's depiction within the narrative, keeping an eye on that kind of feminist interpretation. Does she come across as kind of a weak character, as a strong character? How is that relationship kind of done? So I would doing kind of just on a page, possibly in a kind of diagrammatic form, however makes you happy, but a close focusing on Fiona and Dakin. I would be spending kind of probably about 20 minutes doing this. Try and apply terminology where you can, because remember, this assessment, it's all 5 assessment objectives. You're going to need to get terminology in. You're going to need to be actually analysing the evidence. So how is that evidence creating this impression? You don't just want to go, this is the overall impression, and leave it at that. You've got to be kind of developing around it as well. Okay, so pause me here, doing whatever form makes you happy. But focusing in and using those kind of pages and thinking about small bits as part of it. Don't just think about the overall thing. Which direct bits of evidence would you pull out? Okay, so in terms of kind of looking at this, in that first reference to kind of Fiona, currently I am seeing Fiona, the headmaster's secretary, not that he knows. Now, there's a number of things you can kind of note there. She's kind of defined by her position in relation to kind of the headmaster's secretary. She becomes an object within that. It's possessive. Dakin is, I am currently seeing Fiona. It's the kind of sentence construction here with him in kind of the active position. It does place kind of the focus onto him. We haven't done it yet, So you get the kind of euphemistic reference to sex, but and that's the kind of primary focus here. He's more interested in that beyond anything else. That is the kind of initial consideration. And then you get this kind of, we'll talk about more in a second, but when we do, I'm hoping one of these times might be on his study floor, and then he kind of continues this. It's like the headmaster says, one should have targets. So there is within this as well also a kind of competitive angle. This is something we'll kind of build up around Dakin tomorrow when we kind of talk about sexuality as well. Fiona is kind of part of this power game essentially that he's playing here. Well, that's how kind of Bennett depicts it. He's more interested in kind of almost competing with the headmaster, of kind of, abusing his personal spaces than he is in, again, Fiona as an individual. So it's that kind of primary focus on the sexual angle. It's the way that she fits within this kind of power structure, the kind of gaming of this, and that sort of straight away focus on her as kind of an objectified figure here. Okay, and then we go to our kind of second reference to her. Now, this is where we get kind of introduced to the kind of extended metaphor that's used around her. She becomes essentially linked into this World War I metaphor. And this is kind of extended across the next occasion where she comes into it. And within it, at certain points, she gets kind of depicted as either the ground that's being fought over, but also kind of depicted as a kind of antagonist here as well. She's the kind of the Hun at various points as well. So she is his Western Front, and he kind of reconnoitered the ground. He's kind of scouting out the ground here. And there's only token resistance. So it does imply that she's kind of got some level of control, but she's not really resisting him. He's in kind of the power control situation here. You want to think about the kind of overall situation that Bennett places this into. Hello, cat. Go away, cat. Yeah, where this is all disclosed to Scripps here, in terms of right. I think the cat's done being helpful now. So he places this into this kind of discourse with Scripps. This is kind of essentially locker room talk. There's a kind of lads banter aspect to it as well. And he kind of, again, the focus within this is on the kind of the sexual angle. There's no link to the kind of emotional angle. There's no link into anything really beyond that. It's a pursuit and a fight over her body as an object. So you get these kind of euphemistic references, the actual place. I mean, not onto it and certainly not into it, but up to it. So again, it's linked into this kind of idea of this sexual advance, this kind of conflict between man and woman, but it's clearly he's in a position of power. At which point the Hun, if I may so characterise the fair Fiona, suddenly dug in. No further deployments were sanctioned. And around 2300 hours, our forces withdrew. Whereas I'd begun the evening thinking this might be the big push. So it all fits in with this kind of battle metaphor. this kind of idea of kind of the forces being dug in is her kind of resistance, her holding out in terms of this. But again, he's like, whereas I'd begun the evening thinking this might be the big push, the idea that he is, that's his main and primary intention, his kind of what he's seeking for within this, is the kind of sexual gratification. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so he kind of extends the metaphor. He's aware he's kind of using metaphorical language, and he kind of implies that this is a kind of ongoing process, that it's almost a kind of game that they've been playing. I mean, just as moving up the frontline troops presumably had to pass the sides of previous battles where every inch of territory had been hotly contested, so it is with me. So her body again returns to that image of the battleground, and there are kind of various areas that he's been initially denied access to, he's not been allowed to touch, but now the precedent's been set and he's able to. And it becomes slightly cruder. We move away from kind of the more kind of distanced metaphors, like particularly her tits, which only fell after a prolonged campaign some 3 weeks ago, and to which I now have immediate access, and which were indeed the start line for last night's abortive thrust southwards. And you know, the whole idea of the abortive thrust itself is kind of sexualized. Now, the other thing to kind of note within this, he does reveal to us at this point that Felix, or the headmaster here, is also kind of pursuing Fiona in a kind of lecherous way. Still, at least I'm doing better than Felix. Tries to chase her around the desk, hoping to cop a feel. Well, again, where Dakin's relationship with her is kind of consensual, if kind of there's a sort of the metaphor of the conflict, it is consensual. We also see Fiona is kind of then objectified by the headmaster as well. The implication potentially that she's been employed for her looks and because the headmaster desires her. There's something non-consensual in the kind of chasing her around the desk. And again, it's kind of euphemistic, but kind of copper feel, the kind of lecherous aspect to it there. And again, you see this in sort of various of the adaptations. In the film adaptation, the headmaster is kind of given this perverted aspect towards Fiona. Right, and then the last one, the Weimar Republic one. Okay, so on the kind of page 80 to 81 references, again, the focus is on sex as opposed to anything else. It's done wonders for sex life. Apparently I talk about him so much, Fiona gets really pissed off. Doing it is about the only time I shut up. So again, it's this discourse with Scripps again, focus straight in on the kind of the sexual elements. He's referencing kind of talking about Irwin a lot, and it's sort of simply a way to shut him up. So it is kind of hinting at a kind of a longer discourse here, that there is kind of slightly more around the relationship. But he returns to this kind of image here of kind of post World War I Germany. Broke through, had the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, it's now the Weimar Republic, and kind of Scripps rhetorically questions decadence, and then you then get kind of Dakin's stage direction. Dakin nods happily. So the image here, post World War I, the Weimar Republic was kind of supposedly a time of affluence in at least certain areas of German society. The kind of idea of decadence here, again, linking in with the stage direction and implying kind of in a sort of sexualized sense. And Scripps is kind of depicted as kind of challenging on this. Aren't you frightened it's all going to be over too soon? What, sex? I mean, what have you got to look forward to? Now again, we can link this in because, again, within the context of this kind of male narrative, those kind of questions from scripts also are important in that they imply that sex is the kind of climactic point of the relationship, but there's nothing beyond that. There's no that he's reached the kind of peak of the relationship and that's it. And Dakin simply was more of the same. So again, it's not just coming through from kind of Dakin here. Right, just to kind of finish off around Fiona. You can kind of question. So remember, with these essays, with this coursework, you are going to want to do kind of different interpretations, different viewpoints. And whilst she is in many ways a kind of marginalized figure, an objectified figure, you can debate around that, at least to an extent. If we consider page 102 and the very brief reference to this. Also, this is the big triumph. I had a session with Felix. I asked him what the difference was between Hector touching us up on the bike and him trying to feel up Fiona. He was upset naturally and the language was shocking, but eventually he took the point, and the upshot is Hector is reprieved. He stays. So, again, it's only a very debatable point. You don't have to kind of agree with it entirely, but what they're looking for within the essays is for you to kind of debate around it slightly. Now, Fiona here, she's still marginalized, she's still not seen on stage, she's still kind of referenced through Dakin, but in a certain way she is the figure that defeats the headmaster in his desire to get rid of Hector. She is, yes, this happens kind of through the fact that she's been objectified, but it does give her a level of power, if only through Dakin. So yes, it becomes a debatable point, but it's possibly something you want to build in within essays around if you're using Fiona to simply show that she's, as a plot device, she is important, because although Hector dies very shortly afterwards, she does give Hector his job back. She is integral in stopping him being fired, being sacked. So Bennett gives her a level of kind of power towards the end here. Right. Oh, sorry, before I move on, the other thing to kind of mention around it, obviously, if you're doing the kind of the abuse question round here, think about Felix as kind of part of this. You can say, well, whilst he isn't directly abusive as a teacher towards the boys at this point, there is a kind of abuse of power here that kind of crosses over into the wider play. Right, so we then get kind of Mrs. Lintar, and in many ways she can be viewed as kind of the other side to this. She is the kind of only present female figure on stage. Now, we'll focus on her in terms of kind of two sides here. We'll look at her to start with in relation to the way that she kind of challenges gender stereotypes. But again, we want to think about ways in which we can debate around her characterization as well. So, she is presented as very self-aware, and not just of her own position, but she's also presented as kind of perceptive around the other characters. So where a lot of the characters on stage aren't really aware of what they're doing and why they're doing, she kind of is able to kind of show the audience. She's able to kind of depict this more directly. And she also kind of very directly challenges at various points, and indeed she actually breaks the fourth wall a couple of times, and directly kind of talks to the audience around this as well. She directly challenges the audience around their kind of perceptions of gender within the play. And it's not just within the kind of close confines of the play and what's happening within the play. Mrs. Lintott, as a history teacher, is depicted as kind of challenging the whole educational establishment and sort of the history of history, essentially, and the way that history has been approached as a subject. So she becomes a kind of figure to the Benny's kind of create a wider critique. Okay. So just kind of, cut to it, at the moment, she can be viewed as an empowering female figure. So what I'd like to do on this time, we want to think around kind of the debate angle with Lintott a bit more, because whereas Fiona, you can only make a kind of mild point of debate, she is pretty much objectified. With Lintott, you can kind of do this slightly more broadly. So I would be inclined, as you're making notes on this, to kind of split the page probably, and to have kind of one half of it Lintott as a figure of empowerment, on the other half of it, which is what we'll look at in a minute, have Lintott as a figure of kind of disempowerment's the wrong word, as remaining a marginalized figure. Okay. My recommendations, there's quite a lot of kind of places where she comes into it that we'll kind of go through in a minute, but I would suggest you kind of look around those pages that are referenced there. Think here exactly where she comes in, what Bennett has her say, what the kind of purpose of this is. Again, try and think of terminology alongside that you could work in as part of it. And I would spend probably, to cover those, 20, 25 minutes, maybe up to 30 minutes kind of going through on this side, finding how she's kind of depicted as a challenge to start with. Okay, so if you look at the bit on page 22 and 23, one of the first things that you kind of might note is the way that she doesn't necessarily conform to kind of gender stereotypes. So those of you who do kind of English language as well, you'll have looked at kind of gender theorists and the fact that women are supposedly even, they will swear less than men. She's actually one of the figures that swears more than any of the others. So you get the reference to Dakin as cunt struck, where she uses the kind of, the vulgarity here. And it defies the kind of gender stereotypes. And you get Hector kind of, Dorothy, shocked by this, but it does kind of help characterize her as kind of deviant from the gender norms. And she kind of, this is the first point even, where she starts to challenge kind of history and men as a whole here. So you get storytelling, so much of it, which is what men do naturally. So you could talk here about the kind of the adverb choice. It's naturally, she's kind of implying for men, a lot of the time, they don't tell the truth, they tell stories. That a lot of the time it's kind of constructions. And you get the reference to her ex. Now, this is potentially an interesting point, something we'll come back to with the kind of the counter side to Mrs. Lintott. Now, it suggests that at some point she has been married and she's chosen to kind of, or not I say chosen, but she's sort of now single. Now, that can be either empowering or it can be kind of an aspect of her kind of not desexualized, but she has to kind of reject the masculine world. Anyway, sorry. Back to this. There are other bits you might kind of note, although it's not kind of directly related into gender. Again, what Bennett is doing here is giving Mrs. Lintott a number of the more kind of perceptive lines, a number of the more kind of interesting points. And she makes an important point around kind of educational structures here. These days, teachers just remember the books they discovered and loved as students and shoved them on the syllabus. Then they wonder why their pupils aren't as keen on them as they are. no discovery is why. So she kind of points out, or Bennett uses her to point out, one of the problems within the educational system. It can fit into the dangers of education potentially if you want it to. You can also use it to kind of show how she's depicted as a figure of insight. She's, pointing out the flaw within kind of being overly rigid with the teaching structure, with forcing texts upon people, and not recognizing that a lot of the experience within that is a subjective experience. Just because one person enjoys something doesn't mean another person will enjoy it. So you could also pick that apart there as well. If you look on page 41 to 43 then, as a kind of continuation, again, it's not necessarily within these pages that Lintar is doing that kind of direct challenge to the kind of patriarchal system, but again, she's given some of the more insightful lines of the play, the more perceptive lines of the play. And again, these fit in with the different kind of questions. One of the hardest things for the boys to learn is that a teacher is human. One of the hardest things for a teacher to learn is not to try and tell them. So she's recognizing that kind of disconnect in the relationship between teacher and student. She's kind of, you've got the superlative use there. It becomes a kind of a broader comment here. It's not the boys, it's for boys to learn, for a teacher to learn. So she's using the kind of the indefinite article, she's using the plural. So this becomes a comment, not just again about the situation that they're in, but about the kind of wider situations across the whole country. She also is kind of presented as quite perceptive around kind of Erwin and around this, that his relationship with the students as well. She's kind of perceptive around that. She kind of questions it's in relation to where kind of Posner comes out to Erwin with Dakin. So she's the first one to kind of maybe hint that she's picked up on Erwin's sexuality. There's a kind of insight given there, and where she later talks about it's a test, a way of finding out if you've ceased to be a teacher and become a friend. So she's aware of the kind of psychology around the exchange with Posner as well, the use of the kind of taboo with it. So it's worth noting at that section, there are various bits that you could pull out from that. There's other terminology we could apply, but let's move on to the next one on page 50. Okay, so again with page 50, she is just again presented as kind of the more insightful, the more kind of switched on of the characters. One thing you will learn if you plan to stay in this benighted profession is that the chief enemy of culture in any school is always the headmaster, where she kind of metaphorically presents him as a kind of antagonistic figure again, that he becomes the kind of enemy and the enemy of culture. So she sees him as a kind of destructive force, the headmaster. She's also kind of perceptive around Hector as well. Hector's kind of motivations. Lintar is kind of presented as the kind of psychological voice here. She's aware that Hector is kind of trying to essentially kind of vicariously live through the students. He's trying to be the kind of teacher that pupils will remember, somebody they will look back on. Which she doesn't see herself as something, which is something one will never do. But it implies that, she's aware that Hector is unfulfilled in other areas of his life, and that he kind of gains fulfillment through these kind of interactions with the students and the effect he'll have on them there. Then we have, okay, now it gets more interesting as you go into kind of page 68 and 69. we'll kind of point out the kind of context in which this initially appears to start with. So the headmaster's talking about kind of firing Hector. Now, initially, he makes kind of some kind of crude sexual references. And I was so pleased on the night Mrs. Armstrong told me she was startled to find that she was the object of unaccustomed sexual interference herself. That is the measure of how pleased I was, though I shan't say that to the inspectors. So the headmaster here is sort of implying that his wife revealing what Hector's kind of done actually kind of leads him to a state of arousal, shall we put it. Now, Lintott here, initially, the stage direction is quite important. Mrs. Lintott says nothing, so she cannot, in the context of the play, kind of overtly challenge the headmaster. However, as we go down the page, she's left on stage on her own, and she talks to the audience. She talks to the audience, and as a character, essentially. So as she's aware of herself as a character, she breaks the fourth wall. I have not hitherto been allotted an inner voice. My role, a patient and not unamused sufferance of the predilections and preoccupations of men. So she's aware that she's a marginalized figure. She's kind of drawing the audience's attention to that by breaking the fourth wall, by sort of showing that self-awareness. I've not been given the kind of inner voice. I've not been looked at as a kind of, I haven't been given the deeper psychology potentially. And she's aware of herself as simply a kind of a sideline figure viewing events as well. They kick their particular stone along the street and I watch. So she's kind of, in the analogy here, she places herself outside of it. She's a viewer. She's simply a watcher. She's not taking part. The men are kind of kicking their stone down the street and she simply is placed in a position watching. Yeah, so she's kind of positioned by Bennett as kind of aware of all the different elements. I'm confided in by all parties. Her gender becomes a metaphorical kind of safeguard against the onward transmission of information. But again, she shows a level of awareness. It's in itself condescending. And she's aware of how men view her. I'm what men would call a safe pair of hands. So these couple of pages are interesting because of that kind of breaking of the fourth wall that Bennett has her do, because of the way she kind of shows that self-awareness and what that kind of implies, how she's kind of directly challenging and showing kind of frustration around her positioning here. Okay, and whereas you get the breaking of the kind of fourth wall in the page we just looked at, as you go kind of further on, you get her kind of directly challenging the boys within the context of the play. So I hesitate to mention this, lest it occasion a sophisticated groan, but it may not have crossed your minds that one of the dons who interviews you may be a woman. So here she's kind of implying that the boy's response, there's a sarcasm to her here. Right, sorry. Yeah, sorry, the sarcasm that kind of goes within it, there's an implication that it's not even been considered by them. It may not have crossed your mind. And we see the boys actually kind of responding in the way she kind of implies here. Dakin, it's obviously dispiriting to you, Dakin, or you wouldn't be yawning. So she's kind of directly challenging them on their perceptions of the world in relation to kind of gender here. But there is a kind of disinterest shown by the boys around this, which shows a kind of legitimacy to what she's saying. Dakin yawns, you've got the kind of implied stage direction to that. You get her kind of rhetorically questioning, am I embarrassing you? And Tim's kind of responding, yes. Now, the boys are important within this exchange because they see the kind of patriarchy as a fact of life. Tim's response, it's not our fault, miss. It's just the way it is. So the implication here is that the boys have accepted the status quo as unchangeable and fixed. And Lockwood even uses the kind of Wittgenstein quote to go with it. The world is everything that is the case. She then is presented as the voice who calls this into question. And we get that. So she kind of, again, kind of rhetorical questions as you go further down. Can you for a moment imagine how dispiriting it is to teach 5 centuries of masculine ineptitude? So she's kind of challenging this idea of male superiority. She's kind of, she's implying that for women it is dispiriting. You could talk about simply ineptitude as our kind of abstract noun here, implying a kind of inadequacy of the male figure. And she then kind of questions more directly, why do you think there are no women historians on TV? And we then see the kind of sexism coming back in again, that she's not necessarily taken seriously as she makes this remark. And Tim's kind of reduced it no tits. So it's both comic, but it also shows that wide-ranging kind of patriarchal values that are kind of running through both the play and kind of wider society. And Lintott then kind of essentially shows her frustration here. And the stage direction that kind of follows this is important. There is silence, because it does suggest that the boys have been hit by her words that kind of go with this, that Bennett wants to see them as affected by her words. So various bits that you could kind of pick out from this. She kind of points out that women historians are not kind of as showy as the male historians. They don't come bouncing up to you with every new historical notion they've come up with, the bow wow school of history. So that kind of sarcasm, that challenge to kind of male historians, she kind of, again, implies that historically women have been marginalized. It's not such a frolic for women as it is for men. And she kind of shows these instances in history where women have been marginalized. In 1919, for instance, they just arranged the flowers, then retired. History becomes a commentary on the various and continuing incapabilities of men, and kind of women is history is women following behind with a bucket. So her metaphor use, her analogy use here all suggests that she's kind of more directly challenging these kind of historical patriarchal views here. And I'm not asking you to espouse this point of view, but the occasional nod in its direction can do you no harm. So she's sort of suggesting, change the way that you view this here. You don't have to kind of completely change, but she is kind of directly challenging. Okay, and I'll try to be a bit briefer with these other points quickly. There will be other things you can pick out though. So on 92 and 93, again, it's just important. There's the level of perception that comes into it, the insight that you could talk about from her into kind of the relationship Hector has with his wife, and the way she talks about history, the kind of, one random incident can have a profound effect. As part of it. As you go on to kind of page 95, again, she's the kind of voice that challenges Hector. Hector, darling, love you as I do. That is the most colossal voice. A grope is a grope. It's not the Annunciation, you twerp. So where Hector is kind of presenting his actions as kind of in a religious kind of context, she's presented as kind of challenging him on this. showing that this is, it's not the Annunciation, it's not the announcing of Christ. It's something different from that. So Bennett here, having her once again in a kind of an insightful role, in a challenging role, as a kind of, pointing out the realities of the situation that the other characters on stage are not necessarily aware of. She's used here as a kind of voice of reason. Okay. Now, the last thing to say is that simply she is the one who is essentially given by Bennett the kind of main section at the close of the play. Yes, Hector gets the very last bit, but Mrs. Lintott is the one who kind of describes the boy's future, futures to us even, and she's then given kind of, whereas throughout the play as a whole she's quite marginalised, here at the close she's given quite a wide section of dialogue and kind of knowledge here that kind of leaves us with that on our closing point. Okay, last bit. You just need to go back. You want to be able to evidence around this. You want to be able to kind of talk around the way that in certain respects she's undermined here. So go back through the play, just look out for Lintott cropping up again. Look at some of the bits we've already looked at. Use this, kind of fill out your other side to see how she can be viewed as kind of, on one level she's a powerful feminist figure. On another level, Bennett's maybe failed with her in terms of how she's used. Now, a couple of things to kind of consider as you're doing this. The fact that she is kind of desexualized is important. Yeah, so essentially her powerful feminist voice comes at the price of her kind of sacrificing her sexuality. It continues that idea that to be a feminist, or feminists are often not very feminine in that respect. Other things to kind of think here, the fact that she's kind of marked out is as kind of single. We've already kind of mentioned this, the reference to the ex-husband. Think about the casting in various performances as well. So you could potentially talk about the fact that she's kind of, yes, she's going to be kind of older, but very often she's kind of presented as a not terribly attractive, or cast as a not terribly attractive figure, and simply that she's a minor character throughout the play. So just go back through, find some bits around the kind of way she's desexualized, her singularities pointed out. I'll just point out a few kind of points afterwards, and then that's us done for the day. Okay, so we'll just point out kind of a couple of points in relation to this then. Mrs. Lintott talks about her own experience, and she's been to Durham. This is on page 9. Durham was very good for history. It's where I had my first pizza. Other things too, of course, but it's the pizza that really stands out. Now, this is kind of important because the other things potentially is kind of euphemistic. It's sort of implying something sexual about it, but it's the pizza that stands out for her. So the image here is one that kind of, again, it takes her back even in her younger days, because we're now seeing her as kind of, near to retirement. She kind of is desexualized at that point. She's more sort of, the pizza is more memorable than any kind of sexual experience there. We get other references, so other things we've picked up on as we've covered the other bits, but a couple of other bits we might point out, where she's talking about nicknames, and unsurprisingly, I am Tot or Totty. Some irony there, one feels. So while she's a kind of female teacher trying to kind of draw out, to push them to think about history in a different way, that reference to her as tot or totty is kind of sexualizing. It's a kind of slang term around a woman, and it's kind of reductive in relation to her. Okay, super kind of brief summary if I can. You want to be able to, if you're doing the gender and sexuality question, talk about how different female figures are presented, to be able to debate around them, to build in evidence and talk around how that evidence either empowers or objectifies them, and whether Bennett is then successful in kind of presenting a more feminist point of view through the play. That's kind of point number one. Just remember, Lintott does important things around kind of pointing out dangers in education as well, the kind of problems in the wider academic sphere, and that with Fiona, the abuse angle can also potentially come into it as part of your argument, okay? But we'll leave it there for the moment. Tomorrow we'll look around the kind of depictions of sexuality in the two. Okay, bye bye people.